The estates of the realm were the broad orders of social hierarchy used in Christendom from the medieval period to early modern Europe. Different systems for dividing society members into estates developed and evolved over time. The best-known system is the French Ancien Régime, a three-estate system used until the French Revolution. This system was made up of clergy, nobility, and commoners. Some countries, notably Scandinavia and Russia, split burghers and rural commoners into separate estates, creating a four-estate system with rural commoners ranking the lowest is the fourth estate. In England, a two-estate system evolved that combined nobility and bishops into one lordly estate with commons as the second estate. This system produced the two houses of parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. In southern Germany, a three-estate system of nobility, ritters, and burghers was used. Today the term fourth estate usually refers to forces outside the established power structure, most commonly in reference to the independent press or media. Historically, in Northern and Eastern Europe, the fourth estate meant rural commoners. Social immobility. During the Middle Ages, individuals were born into the class and change in social position was difficult. The medieval church was the institution where social mobility was most likely up to a certain level. Typically, however, only nobility were appointed to the highest church positions, although low nobility could aspire to the highest church positions. Since clergy could not marry, such mobility was theoretically limited to one generation, though in practice senior clergy might be able to greatly influence the social and financial fortunes of the relatives. Another possible way to rise in social position was due to exceptional military or commercial success. Such families were rare and the rise to nobility required royal patronage at some point. Dynamics. Medieval political speculation is imbued to the marrow with the idea of a structure of society based upon distinct orders. Johann Huissinger observes, the virtually synonymous terms estate and order designated a great variety of social realities, not at all limited to a class, Huissinger concluded, but applied to every social function, every trade, every recognizable grouping. There are, first of all, the estates of the realm, but there are also the trades, the state of matrimony and that of virginity, the state of sin. At court there are the four estates of the body and mouth, bread masters, cupbearers, carvers, and cooks. In the church there are sacerdotal orders and monastic orders. Finally, there are the different orders of chivalry. This static view of society was predicated on inherited positions. Commoners were universally considered the lowest order. The higher estate's necessary dependency on the commoner's production, however, often further divided the otherwise equal common people into burghers of the realm, cities and towns, and the peasants and serfs of the realms surrounding lands and villages. A person's estate and position within it were usually inherited from the father and his occupation, similar to a caste within that system. In many regions and realms there also existed population groups born outside these specifically defined resident estates. Legislative bodies or advisory bodies to a monarch were traditionally grouped along lines of these estates, with the monarch above all three estates. Meetings of the estates of the realm became early legislative and judicial parliaments. Monarchs often sought to legitimize the power by requiring oaths of fealty from the estates. Today, in most countries, the estates have lost all the legal privileges, and are mainly of historical interest. The nobility may be an exception, for instance due to legislation against false titles of nobility. Similarly, British government well maintains the distinction witness its House of Lords and the House of Commons. One of the earliest political pamphlets to address these ideas was called What is the Third Estate? It was written by Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès in January 1789, shortly before the start of the French Revolution. Background: after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, numerous geographic and ethnic kingdoms developed among the endemic peoples of Europe, affecting the day-to-day secular lives. Along with those, the growing influence of the Catholic Church and its papacy affected the ethical, moral and religious lives and decisions of all. This led to mutual dependency between the secular and religious powers for guidance and protection. But over time, and with the growing power of the kingdoms, competing secular realities increasingly diverged from religious idealism and church decisions. The new lords of the land identified themselves primarily as warriors, but because new technologies of warfare were expensive, and the fighting men required substantial material resources and considerable leisure to train, these needs had to be filled. The economic and political transformation of the countryside in the period were filled by a large growth in population, agricultural production, technological innovations and urban centers. Movements of reform and renewal attempted to sharpen the distinction between clerical and lay status, and power, recognized by the Church, also had their effect. As a result of the investiture controversy of the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the powerful office of Holy Roman Emperor lost much of its religious character and retained a more nominal universal preeminence over other rulers, though it varied. The struggle over investiture and the reform movement also legitimized all secular authorities, partly on the grounds of their obligation to enforce discipline. In the 11th and 12th centuries, thinkers argued that human society consisted of three orders: those who pray, those who fight, and those who labor. The structure of the first order, the clergy, was in place by 1200 and remained singly intact until the religious reformations of the 16th century. The very general category of those who labor diversified rapidly after the 11th century into the lively and energetic worlds of peasants, skilled artisans, merchants, financiers, lay professionals, and entrepreneurs, which together drove the European economy to its greatest achievements. The second order, those who fight, was the rank of the politically powerful, ambitious, and dangerous. Kings took pains to ensure that it did not resist their authority. By the 12th century, most European political thinkers agreed that monarchy was the ideal form of governance. This was because it imitated on earth the model set by God for the universe. It was the form of government of the ancient Hebrews and the Christian, biblical basis. The later Roman Empire, and also the peoples who succeeded Rome after the 4th century. Kingdom of France. France under the Ancien Régime divided society into three estates: the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. The king was considered part of no estate. First estate. The first estate comprised the entire clergy, traditionally divided into higher and lower clergy. Although there was no formal demarcation between the two categories, the upper clergy were effectively clerical nobility. For the families of the second estate, in the time of Louis XVI, every bishop in France was a nobleman, a situation that had not existed before the 18th century. At the other extreme, the lower clergy constituted about 90% of the first estate, which in 1789 numbered around 130,000. Second estate. The second estate was the French nobility and royalty, other than the monarch himself, who stood outside of the system of estates. The second estate is traditionally divided into noblesse d'acute and noblesse de robe, the magisterial class that administered royal justice and civil government. The Second Estate constituted approximately 1.5% of France's population. Under the Ancien Régime, the Second Estate were exempt from the corvée royale and from most other forms of taxation such as the gabelle and, most important, the taille. This exemption from paying taxes led to the reluctance to reform. Third Estate. The Third Estate comprised all of those who were not members of the above and can be divided into two groups, urban and rural, together making up 98% of France's population. The urban included the bourgeoisie as well as wage laborers. The rural included free peasants who could be prosperous and villains. The free peasants paid disproportionately high taxes compared to the other estates and were unhappy because they wanted more rights. In addition, the First and Second Estates relied on the labor of the Third, which made the latter's unequal status all the more glaring. There were an estimated 27 million people in the Third Estate when the French Revolution started. Men and women shared the hard life of physical labor and food shortages. Most were born within this group and died as a part of it, too. It was extremely rare for people of this ascribed status to make it out into another estate. Those who did so managed as a result of either being recognized for their extraordinary bravery in a battle or entering religious life. A few commoners were able to catch the eye of the Second Estate, marry, and join them, although this was quite rare. Estates General. The First Estates General was actually a general citizen assembly that was called by Philip IV in 1302. In the period leading up to the Estates General of 1789, France was in the grip of an unmanageable public debt, terrible inflation and widespread food scarcity. This led to widespread popular discontent and produced a group of Third Estate representatives pressing a comparatively radical set of reforms, much of it in alignment with the goals of Finance Minister Jacques Necker, but very much against the wishes of Louis XVI's court and many of the hereditary nobles forming his Second Estate allies. When he could not persuade them to rubber-stamp his ideal program, Louis XVI sought to dissolve the Estates General, but the Third Estate held out for the right to representation. The lower clergy eventually sided with the Third Estate, and the king was forced to yield. Thus, the Estate General meeting was an invitation to revolution. By June, when continued impasses led to further deterioration in relations, the Estates General was reconstituted first as the National Assembly, seeking a solution for the realm independent of the king's management of the meetings of the Estates General, which occasionally continued to meet. These self-organized meetings are today defined as the epoch of end, beginning the historical epoch of the French Revolution, during which, after several more weeks of civil unrest, the body assumed a new status as a revolutionary legislature, the National Constituent Assembly. This unitary body composed of the former representatives of the three estates stepping up to govern along with an emergency committee in the power vacuum existing after the Bourbon monarchy fled Paris. Among the assembly was Maximilien de Robespierre, an influential member of the Jacobins who would years later become instrumental in the turbulent period of violence and political upheaval in France known as the Reign of Terror. United Kingdom. Whilst the estates were never formulated in a way that prevented social mobility, the English Parliament was long based along the classic estate lines, being composed on the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons. The tradition where the Lords Spiritual and Temporal sat separately from the Commons began during the reign of Edward III in the 14th century. Notwithstanding the House of Lords Act 1999, the British British Parliament still recognises the existence of the three estates: the Commons in the House of Commons, the nobility in the House of Lords, and the clergy in the form of the Church of England bishops, also entitled to sit in the upper house as the Lords Spiritual. Scotland. The members of the Parliament of Scotland were collectively referred to as the Three Estates, also known as the Community of the Realm, and until 1690 composed of the First Estate of Prelates, the Second Estate of Lairds and Lieutenants-in-Chief, the Third Estate of Borough Commissioners. The First Estate was overthrown during the Glorious Revolution and the accession of William III. The Second Estate was then split into two to retain the division into three. A Shire Commissioner was the closest equivalent of the English office of Member of Parliament, namely a commoner, a member of the lower nobility. Because the Parliament of Scotland was unicameral, all members sat in the same chamber, as opposed to the separate English House of Lords and House of Commons. The Parliament also had university constituencies. The system was also adopted by the Parliament of England when James VI ascended to the English throne. It was believed that the universities were affected by the decisions of Parliament and ought therefore to have representation in it. This continued in the Parliament of Great Britain after 1707 and the Parliament of the United Kingdom until 1950. Sweden and Finland. The estates in Sweden and later also Russia's Grand Duchy of Finland were the two higher estates, nobility and clergy, and the two lower estates, burghers and land-owning peasants. Each were free men, and had specific rights and responsibilities, and the right to send representatives to the Riksdag of the estates. At the Riksdag, each estate voted as a single body. Since early 18th century, a bill needed the approval of at least three estates to pass, and constitutional amendments required the approval of all estates. Prior to the 18th century, the king had the right to cast a deciding vote if the estates were split evenly. After Russia's conquest of Finland in 1809, a Finnish House of Nobility was codified in 1818 in accordance with the Old Swedish law of 1723. However, the Diet of Finland and its four estates was not convened until 1863. There was also a population outside the estates. Unlike in other areas, people had no full estate, and were not peasants unless they came from a landowner's family. A summary of this division is: nobility was exempt from tax, had an inherited rank and the right to keep a fief, and had a tradition of military service and government. Nobility was codified in 1280 with the Swedish king granting exemption from taxation to landowners that could equip a cavalryman for the king's army. Around 1400, letters patent were introduced. In 1561 the ranks of count and baron were added, and in 1625 the House of Nobility was codified as the first estate of the land. Following Axel Oxenstierna's reform, high government offices were open only to nobles. However, the nobility still owned only their own property, not the peasants of the land as in much of Europe. Heads of the noble houses were hereditary members of the Assembly of Nobles. The nobility is divided into titled nobility and lower nobility. Until the 18th century, the lower nobility was in turn divided into knights and esquires such that each of the three classes would first vote internally, giving one vote per class in the assembly. This resulted in great political influence for the higher nobility. Clergy, or priests, were exempt from tax, and collected tithes for the church. After the Swedish Reformation, the church became Lutheran. In later centuries, the estate included teachers of universities and certain state schools. The estate was governed by the state church, which consecrated its ministers and appointed them to positions with a vote in choosing diet representatives. Burghers were city dwellers, tradesmen and craftsmen. trade was allowed only in the cities when the mercantilistic ideology had got the upper hand, and the burghers had the exclusive right to conduct commerce within the framework of guilds. Entry to this estate was controlled by the autonomy of the towns themselves. Peasants were allowed to sell the produce within the city limits, but any further trade, particularly foreign trade, was allowed only for burghers. In order for a settlement to become a city, a royal charter granting market right was required, and foreign trade required royally chartered staple port rights. After the annexation of Finland into Imperial Russia in 1809, mill owners and other proto-industrialists would gradually be included in this estate. Peasants were landowners of land-taxed farms and the families, which represented the majority in medieval times, since most of the population were independent farmer families until the 19th century, not serfs nor villeins. There is a remarkable difference in tradition compared to other European countries. Entry was controlled by ownership of farmland, which was not generally for sale but a hereditary property. After 1809, Swedish tenants renting a large enough farm were included, as well as non-nobility owning tax-exempt land. To no estate belonged propertyless cottages, villeins, tenants of farms owned by others, farmhands, servants, some low administrative workers, rural craftsmen, traveling salesmen, vagrants, and propertyless and unemployed people. To reflect how the people belonging to the estates saw them, the Finnish word for obscene, sarditen, has the literal meaning estateless. In Sweden, the riksdag of the estates existed until it was replaced with a bicameral riksdag in 1866, which gave political rights to anyone with a certain income or property. Nevertheless, many of the leading politicians of the 19th century continued to be drawn from the old estates, in that they were either noblemen themselves, or represented agricultural and urban interests. Ennoblements continued even after the estates had lost the political importance, with the last ennoblement of explorer Sven Hedin taking place in 1902. This practice was formally abolished with the adoption of the new Constitution January 1, 1975, while the status of the House of Nobility continued to be regulated in law until 2003. In Finland, this legal division existed until 1906, still drawing on the Swedish Constitution of 1772. However, at the start of the 20th century most of the population did not belong to any estate and had no political representation. A particularly large class were the rent farmers, who did not own the land they cultivated but had to work in the landowner's farm to pay the rent. Furthermore, the industrial workers living in the city were not represented by the four-estate system. The political system was reformed as a result of the Finnish general strike of 1905, with the last Diet instituting a new constitutional law to create the modern parliamentary system, ending the political privileges of the estates. The post-independence Constitution of 1919 forbade ennoblement, and all tax privileges were abolished in 1920. The privileges of the estates were officially and finally abolished in 1995, although in legal practice, the privileges had long been unenforceable. As in Sweden, the nobility has not been officially abolished and records of nobility are still voluntarily maintained by the Finnish House of Nobility. In Finland, it is still illegal and punishable by jail time to defraud into marriage by declaring a false name or estate. Netherlands. The Netherlands, which until the late 16th century consisted of several counties, prince-bishoprics, duchies, etc., in the area that is now modern Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, had no States General until 1464, when Duke Philip of Burgundy assembled the first States General in Bruges. Later in the 15th and 16th centuries, Brussels became the place where the States General assembled assembled. On these occasions, deputies from the states of the various provinces asked for more liberties. For this reason, the States General were not assembled very often. As a consequence of the Union of Utrecht in 1579 and the events that followed afterwards, the States General declared that they no longer obeyed King Philip II of Spain, who was also overlord of the Netherlands. After the reconquest of the southern part of the Netherlands, the States General first assembled permanently in Middelburg, and in The Hague from 1585 onward. Without a king to rule the country, the States General became the sovereign power. It was the level of government where all things were dealt with that were of concern to all the 7 provinces that became part of the Republic of the United Netherlands. During that time, the States General were formed by representatives of the states of the 7 provinces. In each state sat representatives of the nobility and the cities. As a government, the States General were abolished in 1795. A new parliament was created, called Nationale Vergadering. It no longer consisted of representatives of the states, let alone the estates. All men were considered equal under the 1798 Constitution. Eventually, the Netherlands became part of the French Empire under Napoleon. After regaining independence in November 1813, the name States General was resurrected for a legislature constituted in 1814 and elected by the States Provincial. In 1815, when the Netherlands were united with Belgium and Luxembourg, the States General were divided into 2 chambers, the First Chamber and the Second Chamber. The members of the First Chamber were appointed for life by the King, while the members of the Second Chamber were elected by the members of the States Provincial. The States General resided in The Hague and Brussels in alternate years until 1830, when, as a result of the Belgian Revolution, The Hague became once again the sole residence of the States General. From 1848 on, the Constitution declares that members of the Second Chamber are elected by the people, while the members of the First Chamber are chosen by the members of the States Provincial. As a result, the Second Chamber became the most important. The First Chamber is also called Senate. This, however, is not a term used in the Constitution. Occasionally the First and Second Chamber meet in a Venide Vergadering, for instance on Prinsjesdag, the annual opening of the parliamentary year, and when a new king is inaugurated. Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire had the imperial diet. The clergy was represented by the independent prince-bishops, prince-archbishops and prince-abbots of the many monasteries. The nobility consisted of independent aristocratic rulers, secular prince-electors, kings, dukes, margraves, counts and others. Burghers consisted of representatives of the independent imperial cities. Many peoples whose territories within the Holy Roman Empire had been independent for centuries had no representatives in the imperial diet, and this included the imperial knights and independent villages. The power of the imperial diet was limited, despite efforts of centralization. Large realms of the nobility or clergy had estates of their own that could wield great power in local affairs. Power struggles between ruler and estates were comparable to similar events in the history of the British and French parliaments. The Swabian League, who had significant regional power in its part of Germany during the 15th century, also had its own kind of estates, a governing federal council comprising 3 colleges, those of princes, cities, and knights. Russian Empire. In the late Russian Empire the estates were called soslavias. The 4 major estates were nobility, clergy, rural dwellers, and urban dwellers, with a more detailed stratification therein. The division in estates was of mixed nature, traditional, occupational, as well as formal. For example, voting in Duma was carried out by estates. Russian Empire census recorded the reported estate of a person.